If as we're switching between items, you feel a little peckish in the break room, which if you go out this door down the hall, it'll be on your right. And then there are also a whole bunch of delightful baked goods that are right out here in this big pink box. So thank you for bringing those, Virginia. And I just want to take one moment here at the top of the meeting, because this is a hybrid meeting today. And what we learned in this planning process is that's fully like twice as many logistics and maybe a little bit extra. So I really want to thank Eric, Erica, Hope Miller, Beck Barger, Brittany Young, and Geneva Hutchinson for all their help with supporting this meeting and helping everything run smoothly today. Yeah, thank you. Excellent. So with that, I would like to introduce Virginia Madueño, who is the chair of the Delta Stewardship Council, who's going to officially welcome us to today's forum. Virginia. I don't want to ruin your. Is it okay if I just put my? Yeah, you're fine. Okay, sure.
Hello, everybody. It is truly my honor to welcome all of you to the first Delta Restoration Forum. I'm really excited to say that, the first. I'm thrilled, and I'm sure all of us are thrilled to have so many of you here in person as well as on Zoom, to all of you out in the virtual world. We're getting together today to talk about the future of eco restoration systems in the Delta. As you all know, ecosystem restoration is complex, and I'm learning that more and more on the job. And it's a job that takes a long time, and it requires bringing people together as we're doing today, from a wide variety of backgrounds to share information and to learn from each other. The image behind me shows exactly what this is about. It's bringing people together, such as land managers, scientists, policymakers, and community members coming together, again, such as this photo shown at the Dutch Slough Wetland Restoration Project in Oakley. This type of large-scale restoration involves trade-offs between different land uses, and we are here today to have, again, those open, meaningful dialogues and honest conversations with all of you to understand these trade-offs and these opportunities. As you'll hear more about this afternoon, the Delta Plan was amended in 2022 to include a new policy and new recommendations for restoration, planning, and implementation, and to set ambitious targets for ecosystem restoration by 2050. Many of these recommendations involve improving communication and coordination between restoration planners, tribes, landowners, and of course, local communities. Today, we're taking a big step, a step towards addressing these recommendations and increased transparency around restoration planning and providing a space to get to know each other, to listen to one another with an open mind, and to learn from each other. In this spirit of collaboration, we started our planning for this forum with a community survey to help us determine when and where to meet. With your continued input, we envision hosting at least 2 forums such as this per year in different locations to bring this community together. And I hope you will continue to join us in these critical and important conversations. I just want to put in a little bit of a soundbite. I was at the Tribal Nations Forum earlier this week, and I can tell you, after attending that forum, it became even more apparent for me why these conversations are so important. And me as a layperson, to understand fundamentally that we have to take a look at the entire spectrum. And when tribal nations are saying we should be paying more attention to nature-based solutions, I say absolutely. I want to thank the Planning Committee for the invitation to join you today. And now I will hand it over to Amanda. Jeff, not Amanda, to Jeff. Again, thank you so much for the opportunity. I welcome all of you and look forward to, if I haven't met you, to meeting you. Thank you so much and have a wonderful afternoon.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jeff Henderson. I'm the Delta Stewardship Council Deputy Executive Officer for Planning and Performance, and it's a pleasure to welcome you all here today and look forward to the discussion. We're going to begin this afternoon with a land acknowledgement, acknowledging that the Delta watershed and the larger Bay estuary are located within the ancestral territory of the native peoples of the numerous villages and tribes of the Bay Miwok, the Coast Miwok, the Plains Miwok, Maidu, Nisenan, Ohlone, Patwin, Pomo, Wapo, Wintun, and Yokuts, who make up tribal groups both recognized and unrecognized. We recognize that these people have continually occupied the Bay Delta area for thousands of years. Throughout a violent history of colonization and dispossession, we, as guests, benefit from living and working in the traditional homeland of these native people. We wish to show our respect to them, their ancestors, and their sovereignty by acknowledging the injustices inherent in this history and their current efforts to achieve restorative justice. We acknowledge the ancestors, the elders, and the relatives, and affirm their sovereign rights as First Peoples. We acknowledge that the Delta Plan Interagency Implementation Committee, the Delta Stewardship Council, the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta Conservancy, and other organizations represented here today are benefiting from the displacement and the dispossession of Native people from their traditional homelands. We also acknowledge that Native peoples remain dedicated to fulfilling their obligation to the Creator to care for Mother Earth and all living things, and to return sacredness to the land through the restoration of traditional knowledge and stewardship throughout the Bay Delta. Tribal communities have been stewarding our natural environment since time immemorial. There is much we need to learn from the Bay Delta's tribal communities about stewardship. Please consider that although this statement acknowledges the ancestral and unceded territories of the original Native peoples of the Bay Delta, additional steps are required to move toward meaningful restorative justice. This forum encourages building beneficial and constructive relationships that support tribes in restoring their role as land stewards and elevating and integrating Native communities in the planning and decision-making for a healthy and a resilient Bay Delta. Thank you. Want to take a moment and identify the Delta Plan Interagency Implementation Committee. This is a committee that was established by the Delta Reform Act upon its adoption in the late 2000s. It consists of 19 state and federal agencies, many of whom are represented here today. And these are the agencies that are charged with one or more responsibilities in terms of implementing the Delta Plan, the state's comprehensive resource management plan for the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta. One of the steps that the DPIIC took in 2022 was to formulate a restoration subcommittee. So this is essentially a subcommittee of the main DPIIC that is focused on tasks associated with accomplishing large-scale restoration on the Delta landscape. One of the recommendations included in the 2022 Delta Plan ecosystem amendment that Virginia mentioned earlier is to improve institutional coordination to support the implementation of ecosystem protection, restoration, and enhancement. And the Delta Plan in that amendment envisioned the creation of this subcommittee that has, through its work plan formulation, led to the creation of this forum. So that's a bit of background on sort of how we all came here. I want to give a brief overview of our agenda for today. We're going to continue with the welcoming and introductions. There'll be a short series of presentations on status of restoration efforts in the Delta, as well as the targets established by the Delta Plan for restoration. We will have panel and breakout group discussions. Those of you here in the room see various different tables with numbers on them. You'll also notice your name tags have numbers on them. That's no coincidence. Those two things go together, and we have a parallel activity running on the Zoom on the Zoom side of our workshop today. And again, welcome to all those who are participating remotely. Pleasure to have you here with us today as well. And then following those breakout group discussions, we'll have an open house and a meet and greet. There'll be materials throughout the room. We've invited partners to bring information about projects or initiatives they may be working on in order to share and receive input from this community. So just a bit of community guidelines that I'd like to share just for guiding our discussion today, and just to ask that everyone please adhere to these guidelines as we discuss these topics, which we acknowledge at times can become controversial. Please expect and accept that the work is ongoing, that we are at a stage in an ongoing process. Exercise empathy, stay engaged and participate to your fullest ability. Be attentive to how much space you're occupying. Speak from your own experience and listen with an open mind. Honor the opinions expressed by others. Expect and accept disagreement. Do not be afraid to respectfully challenge others' ideas, but refrain from personal attacks. Be conscious of body language and nonverbal communications or lack thereof, especially for those in the remote environment. Be mindful of your own cultural beliefs and norms, and do not assume that they're universally shared by all participants. With that, I'd like to invite Annie Merritt to come up and give us some direction and introductions concerning the Mentee program for today.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Jeff, and hi, everyone. Annie Merritt with the Delta Stewardship Council. It's nice to be here tonight. So we have quite a few people in the room here, as you can see, and then a lot of people on Zoom. So we want to do some introductions, but in order to keep it as brief as possible, we're going to do a couple things. In a second, we'll have everyone in the room just really quickly say your name and affiliation. That's all. We'll ask that, I think people started doing this already, but for those who haven't yet in the Zoom chat, to add your name and affiliation there. And then while that's going on, we will also we ask that people answer a question on menti.com. So you can see here on the slide, to answer this question, you go to menti.com and then you enter in this code, and you will ask that you answer this question here. How do you connect with the ecosystems and landscapes of the Delta and Suisun Marsh? So I'm going to get going with the in-person introductions, and then I'm going to switch to the Menti screen, but it'll still show you the code. So let's see, Jeff already went, so maybe Campbell, can you start?
Campbell, Ingram, Executive Officer, Delta Conservancy.
Dylan Chapple, Delta Stewardship Council.
Hi, Ken Constable, Delta Stewardship Council.
Rachel Wickinton, Sacramento-San Delta Conservancy.
Virginia Madueño, Delta Stewardship Council.
Trevor Box with the San Delta Conservancy.
Jim Provenza, Yolo County Supervisor.
Anitra Polly, DWR.
I'm Devin Brown with Douglas Environmental.
Hi, Ra'yati Alohe with Resource Environmental Solutions.
Steven Steger, Resources Environmental Solutions.
Carol Maxwell, GEI. Hope Miller, Sacramento-San Delta Conservancy.
Tom Slater, RD 999.
Allegra from Westerville Ecological Services.
Carl Wilcox, California Department of Fish and Wildlife.
Jamil Ibrahim, Stansec.
Kyle Delwich, UC Berkeley.
Harriet Ross, Delta Stewardship Council.
Jamie Bolt, Bethel Harbor, Moreno, and Bethel Island.
Jessica Pearson, Delta Stewardship Council.
Todd Plain, Bureau of Reclamation.
Scott with Bethel Harbor.
Steve Deverell, Hydrofocus.
Amy Williams, Yolo County Resource Conservation District.
Hi, Jessica Davenport, State Coastal Conservancy and San Bay Restoration Subcommittee.
I'm Rachel Robin with ICM.
Corey Saltzman, California Department of Fish and Wildlife.
Keegan King, California Department of Fish and Wildlife.
Aaron Will, Ducks Unlimited.
Martina Cole, Delta Stewardship Council. Virginia Gardner, Delta Protection Division.
Brighton Hurd, Western Belt Ecological Services.
Angela Manuel with Western Valley Ecological.
Ian Long, Delta Stewardship Council.
Cheryl Essex, Yolo County resident.
Mike Moncrief, MBK.
Aaron Hammond, Wildlife Conservation Board.
Jason John, California Natural Resources Agency.
MV, California Natural Resources Agency.
Ivan Seenock, Buena Vista Rancheria of Miwok Indians.
Sheldon Sandu, Buena Vista Rancheria of the Miwok Indians.
Legal Wilderness, board member with the Delta Conservancy.
Katie Thao, State Coastal Conservancy and San Francisco Bay Restoration Authority.
Gilbert Cosio, River Delta Consulting.
Melinda Stalby, Metropolitan Water District. Julie Specia for Metropolitan Water District. Angela Calderon, Department of Water Resources. Charlotte Biggs, Department of Water Resources.
And Michelle Jesperson, also with the Department of Water Resources.
Hi, Karen Burr, Delta Conservancy. Arlie Valencia with Restrict Delta.
Daniel Huang, Environmental Science Associates.
You are. Did we get everyone?
Okay. Thank you, everyone. Okay, I'm gonna hand it over in a second to Campbell Ingram with the Delta Conservancy. Okay.
Good afternoon, everyone. Campbell Ingram, Executive Officer of the Delta Conservancy. Welcome to the Delta Conservancy. It's great. Oh, I can't, yes, I know. Oh, we did this in practice and I forgot. I don't think it goes any further. It's terrible to be tall. So again, welcome to the Delta Conservancy. It's wonderful to see so many people here today. I think we have 50, okay, I'll keep going. 50 people, I believe, are registered to be here in person. I think there's over 150 people on Zoom. So it's really wonderful to see this level of interest and participation in restoration in the Delta. So I really want to thank everybody for being here. Also want to recognize two of our board members, Supervisor Jim Provenza and public appointed member Leo Winternitz are here with us today. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Restoration Subcommittee. As mentioned earlier, the subcommittee is part of the Delta Plan Interagency Implementation Committee. The purpose is really to identify the strategies for reducing barriers to landscape scale restoration and increase estuary-wide coordination. To do that, we really structured sort of three components. First, it is the actual subcommittee itself, and that is members from the 19 agencies, those agencies that are most typically involved in restoration. We've created the ability for us to have task forces to take on specific issues. And in just a minute, I'm going to introduce the planning committee, which is really a task force that helped develop the format and our day-to-day. And the third bin here is really what we're doing today. It's the Restoration Forum. And so it's really exciting to have an opportunity to bring the community in, all the practitioners in, and really talk about what is happening in restoration and how do we get it done. How do we get local input and involvement and understanding, and how do we all move forward together? As I mentioned, there's a planning committee, and it had been co-chaired by Dylan Chapple and Rachel Wigginton. Rachel's on our staff, Dylan's with the Stewardship Council. And then we wanted this really to be as representative or as informed by the community as possible. So we reached out to this group of people to bring them in, help them design this in a way that really resonates with the community and provides input and gets community involvement and engagement. So I want to thank Ivan Seenock from the Miwok band of, the Buena Vista Rancheria of Miwok Indians, and Doug Brown, longtime Delta consultant, worked on many projects in the Delta, Gilbert Cosio, who has been 30 or 40 years now working in the Delta on levee issues, Jason John and Ann Deep with the California Natural Resources Agency, and then Daniel Constable, Viet Long, and Annie Merritt, also all with the Stewardship Council. So they all work together to ultimately identify, structure what we're going to do today, but they came up with a suite of objectives or goals for the day. So the first is we want to provide an overview of the amendments to Chapter 4 of the Delta Plan. So this is newly approved. And it really is looking at how do we do restoration? What are our targets? And how do we anticipate achieving those targets through time? So we want to develop a shared understanding about what that looks like and how we're going to move forward. We want to discuss and provide input on opportunities for implementation of future restoration in the Delta and Suisun Marsh. We want to create an opportunity for you all to have cross-sector relationships and interaction and share information about ecological restoration in the Delta and the Suisun. And then I think equally as important to all of that is really gather feedback and input on the format and content of future restoration forums. So again, anything that, you know, if you're participating here today, your feedback on how do we make this more effective? How do we better bring the community in to gain interaction with the community and understanding about concerns and issues? We want to hear that from you today so that we can structure future events. So before I hand it off to Dylan, I just want to recognize that there's been a tremendous amount of planning that's gone on in the Delta in the past. And the expectation here is really to try to build on that moving forward in the future. So I think a couple of things that are worth recognizing. The Department of Fish and Wildlife did the Delta Conservation Framework many years ago. And that was a very public facing, a lot of public involvement effort to really look at the Delta, understand the stressors and the opportunities, and try to identify how we do restoration effectively in the Delta. The San Francisco Estuary Institute did a multi-year project called the Delta Landscapes Project, and that resulted in 3 volumes. The first volume was what did the Delta look like pre-European contact? How did it function ecologically? The second volume was Delta Transformed, which is essentially how has it changed since European contact? And then Delta Renewed essentially was the third volume that really looked at conceptually, how do we think about restoration, improving ecological function, and work within the Delta systems? So just want to recognize that, you know, that is the basis for a lot of what we'll be doing as we move forward. A lot of the restoration for the targets that we're going to discuss today still requires a fair amount of planning. But again, the intent here with this forum and the Restoration Subcommittee is really working together to figure out how we move forward together. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dylan.
Great, thanks, Campbell. And nice to see you all today. Thanks so much, both virtually and in person. I'm going to go back and forth with Dan Constable on a few things here, just setting the stage for what we're talking about when we're talking about the future of restoration in the Delta. To just orient us in that amendment to the Delta plan that Virginia mentioned, and Jeff and Campbell mentioned as well, there is a goal. And Dan will take care to also point out that this is not a regulatory requirement, but it's a recommendation that brings together previous recommendations. And when you bring those together, there's about 60 to 80,000 acres of restoration that are targeted in the Delta and Suisun Marsh by 2050. And this is above a 2007 baseline. So addressing this goal is one of the big reasons why we're coming together to have these collaborative conversations. And it's important to note here too that this is not just the Delta. When you look statewide, this is very well aligned with priorities like the 30 by 30 initiative being spearheaded by CNRA that are looking to increase both the health and abundance of ecosystems throughout the state. So we're not being asked to do this alone, far from it. We're actually part of this collaborative network that really does span all of California when we're thinking about this work. And of course, the question ahead of us as a group is how we can reconcile ecosystem function and improving ecosystem function in the modern Delta landscape. So these are images from that work that the San Francisco Estuary Institute did that Campbell referred to, with the historical Delta with that lots of green. That's don't need to know what all the categories are, but essentially that's freshwater wetland, what we would have had. And of course, our modern Delta on the other side, which is largely dominated by agriculture. So we are trying to figure out how we can regain some degree of ecological function given the landscape that we have today, and how we can be compatible with uses to the extent possible, acknowledging that there are trade-offs involved. So again, that's really what we've come together today to put our heads together around. one of the documents that's also been critical in conceptualizing this for the Delta has been the Delta Plan. The Delta Plan is our guiding legislation of the Delta Stewardship Council, and it's envisioned as a comprehensive resource management plan for both the Delta and Suisun Marsh that was created initially by the, that was required rather by the Delta Reform Act of 2009. The plan itself was adopted by the council in 2013, and it includes regulations applicable to covered actions for ecosystem restoration and water management, also includes recommendations to other agencies and performance measures to track progress towards these goals. But of course, we're 10 years out from the original Delta Plan now, and so over time, parts of the Delta Plan have changed and been revised due to changing circumstances in the Delta. And so that's where our amendment to Chapter 4, the Ecosystem Amendment, comes in. And I'm going to hand it over to Dan Constable to walk us through a little bit of that background to help get us sort of speaking the same language for our conversation today.
Okay, thank you, Dylan. I'm going to give a high-level overview of our ecosystem amendment. It's over a 1,000-page document, so we're not going to get into all the details today. We're just going to glance over it at a very high level. If you have more questions, please come up to me or other staff, and we're happy to answer those. First, I just want to emphasize that the ecosystem amendment is not a restoration plan. So restoration practitioners here, this is not something that says you shall do this. There's a certain set of plans. It's more high level, setting out a vision, providing guidance for what can be done on the landscape, and setting a goal for how those functions could be restored. On the function side, it does exactly that. It lays out this vision for what functions could be there, given that the Delta is predominantly agriculture now. We have certain constraints and limitations on there. For example, if you want to restore the food web, how do you do that within an agricultural landscape? It also tries to look at and set out a vision for a greater scale that would add diversity and resilience to the landscape. So there has been a lot of restoration that has been done to date. We should acknowledge that. It's quite impressive, really. But if you look at the scale of the Delta on a percentage basis, a lot of that is actually relatively small. We haven't regained some of the geomorphic or biogeochemical processes that used to exist in the Delta. And then lastly, a lot of the amendment is around built into the Delta plan, recognizing that there are human uses, that is central to what we do in the Delta, what's here now. And so we're looking a lot at multi-benefit projects or multi-benefit kind of initiatives that could be put in place. That would be things like having a restoration function, but also helping with flood risk reduction, or having a human connection to adding social benefit, green space, things along those lines. At a high level, the amendment is really part of the Delta plan. It's helping achieve the co-equal goals. And one of those co-equal goals is a restored ecosystem. And so this is really core to what we're doing. Again, want to emphasize there's not specific physical actions under the amendment. And so it's laying out this vision, but there's no specific projects that we're saying this would be done in this way. A little bit of background here. Just taking a step back. So the Delta plan, we're coming up on a 10-year anniversary here. It's important to note that when the Delta plan first was approved in May 2013, there was another large ongoing process called the Bay Delta Conservation Plan, or BDCP. That's a large project. I think most of you are very familiar with it, but because that predated the Delta plan, we essentially deferred to the restoration components of that and said, if the BDCP were approved as a habitat conservation plan, or HCP, it would be incorporated into the Delta plan, and restoration actions on that would effectively be exempt. That was our ecosystem chapter in many ways. In 2015, for various reasons, state agencies pivoted away from this approach, and they pursued a separate approach that had restoration under various mitigation actions, a lot under Eco-Restore, and a separate conveyance project known as WaterFix at the time. When that happened, we immediately did not have this path to bring in what was BDCP into the Delta plan. And so we started thinking about, okay, what do we need to do? How do we address this new gap, essentially, in the Delta plan focused on restoration? Since then, there's been ongoing discussions, really since 2015, 2016 with the council and what that would look like. And that ultimately culminated in adoption of an amendment to Chapter 4, that's the ecosystem chapter of the Delta plan, in June of last year. That has been now adopted. However, we should acknowledge that that is in rulemaking right now. So I do want to emphasize that if you look at our Delta plan, the effective regulations are actually still prior to that. And again, if you have questions on what that means, we have some details, happy to walk more into that. So what is in the amendment? Again, this is going to be a really high level overview. It includes a goal of 60 to 80,000 acres of restoration by 2050 above a 2007 baseline. First, I want to highlight again that these are not regulations. These are goals that are laid out there. However, they are informed by underlying science, so they're not just pulled out of thin air. Second, the acreage goals are above a baseline of 2007. And as Dylan's going to speak about more in a minute, that's important because there's been a lot of work on the landscape. And so this is not saying we need to do an additional 60 to 80,000 acres. This is laying out an overall goal. There's a lot that's been done, and we can count that towards what we need on the landscape. And then lastly, while the goal is not specific as to locations, exact types, what needs to be done where, that kind of thing, there's a non-regulatory performance measure in the Delta plan that describes how this gets added up. And so it looked at 14 recovery plans, various other documents that have specific habitat types. And so that is embedded, but it's also non-regulatory. That's just an example of some of the recovery plans that were examined here. So it goes back to the 2002 Cal-Fed Bay Delta documents, up to 2017 joint venture, Central Valley Flood Protection Plan, the conservation strategy documents of that ilk. There's a lot within there. And so we're able to harness a lot of great science that's gone on in the other ongoing years. And then there's been a lot of other considerations under the amendment itself. So we heard very constructive feedback about adding something called the Good Neighbor Checklist, which we have brought in as essentially a recommendation to restoration practitioners. This is a checklist, a multi-part checklist that has certain types of actions we think people should do if you're implementing a restoration project. So I would boil it down to respecting your neighbors, looking at adjacent land uses, those types of activities. There's a bit under that list. Again, kind of looking at compatibility with adjacent land uses. We've tried to get more feedback from tribal representatives. And so we've sent out, a lot of notices. We had some very constructive conversations, including with some representatives here today. And we've added a mitigation measure, actually a couple, focused around greater tribal involvement in restoration projects specifically. And then I want to acknowledge that there are other mitigation measure and things I'm skipping over, but one to highlight is that there's a social benefits component. And so there's an entirely new policy that is focused on transparency and reporting. And this includes reporting about social benefits. So benefits to local communities, again, example of open space, green space, cultural values that was not incorporated in the past. This map on the right here is showing elevations. It's not a restoration plan. I'd like to emphasize that because we've gotten that question before. The center part here, the white part, is the deeply subsided areas, and it kind of goes up in elevation from there to intertidal to what we consider different sea level rise accommodation zones under different projections, and then floodplain at the highest elevation. I wanted to show this because I think it demonstrates both the constraints and some opportunities in the Delta. So first, the constraints. It's been said by many that elevation is destiny in the Delta. It determines some types of projects you can do and where you can do them. And one of the big gaps that comes out is intertidal. And if you look at where intertidal is and who owns land and some other constraints on water supply and other considerations, there's not a ton of land out there. And we can't just do it anywhere. It has to be in certain locations. But at the same time, there are a lot of opportunities still out in the landscape. And that's been illustrated by how many projects have been done in various locations in Cache Slough and Suisun and throughout the rest of the Delta. And then I want to tie this also back to Delta Adapt. So this is separate from our ecosystem amendment, but it builds on the data here and a lot of the work we've done. And why I want to tie this back is to acknowledge that the council is undertaking a separate process as our climate change initiative. And this highlights further constraints and opportunities. And so we have a vastly changed landscape. On top of that, climate change is here, and it's going to increase the pressures on the system. And so we're trying to look at restoration within that framework as how to improve the situation. How do you acknowledge these constraints that are going to be caused by climate change? So next, I'm going to hand it back to Dr. Dylan Chapple, and he's going to speak about some of the progress that's been made to date and some of the gaps that are still outstanding. So thank you.
Great, thanks, Dan. Switching off here, so appreciate it. So coming back to this this 2007 baseline that is what is set in the ecosystem amendment that Dan spoke about. So one of the key activities now in the early stages since the amendment was developed is determining what progress has been made towards those targets since 2007. Especially in recent years, we've really seen an acceleration of the pace of restoration in the Delta, which has been really exciting. I'm not going to go in too much detail into the methods and everything here, but we took information about restoration projects from the EcoAtlas project tracker that's maintained by the San Francisco Estuary Institute project repository, where people upload both spatial and more general information about their projects. We then did extensive interviews and outreach. Many of you in the room and virtually today participated in that part of the process, so thank you. Helping us ground truth this data from the online source. And we really focused on projects here where there were active changes to create new habitat. So we weren't considering preservation and conservation if there wasn't sort of a shovel in the ground component. And another key part that was just out of the scope of what we were doing is flow. So as I think we all know, flow is also really important in the Delta for species benefits and impacts, but it's harder to quantify in a specific acreage way. And so again, here we're really just focused on these on the ground footprints. Using this information, we looked at projects that have been completed. So all of the initial activities that were scoped are done. Projects that are in progress. I think a notable, really large one is the Lookout Slough project up in the Cache Slough area. And then we also looked at planned projects. And those are projects with a certain level of detail in their planning. So that there are a few earlier stage projects that we know are left out of this spot, but a lot of that was if plans aren't to a certain level of specificity, we didn't quite include them, but we do mention them in our report. And so this is what that looks like mapped onto the landscape. And this gives us a sense of this progress, which has been considerable thanks to the hard work of many of you in the room here and online. When we add that up numerically and look at what this looks like, we pulled out these three different categories. So tidal wetlands, non-tidal wetlands, and a combined category for riparian and floodplain. This was to match those performance measure targets that Dan mentioned that are in the ecosystem amendment, the amendment to Chapter 4. And these were the categories of that where considerable progress had been made since 2007. So when you add up that completed, in progress, and planned, you end up with about a little over 14,000 acres of tidal wetlands, almost 5,000 acres of non-tidal wetlands, and about 2,500 acres of that combined riparian and floodplain. Now, when we take this progress to date and we then associate that with the goals that are associated with the performance measures, you can see that for tidal wetlands, that's 32,500 acres. For non-tidal wetlands, 19,500 acres. And for riparian and floodplain, 16,300 acres. And this, I think, is where we're really interested, I think, in engaging. We're definitely interested in thinking about some of these projects that are in progress or recently completed, but it's really notable here. I'm sorry, the spacing got a little off here with the transition, but that there are still considerable gaps that you see here for each of these. And for those projects, the future is still open, and there is the opportunity for us to come together and really help inform this next generation of projects that's going to fill this gap. This is, of course, a really complicated topic, as we all know. That's why we're bringing you together today, is because these gaps are non-trivial, and it's going to be really important for us to work together to figure out how this happens on the landscape. I will note here also that we're reporting on categories where considerable, measurable progress has been made. There are some additional numbers out there, which is 13,000 acres of oak woodland and 5,100 acres of vernal pool, that we really didn't identify considerable acreage amongst these completed, completed and in progress projects. So looking ahead, that's another big gap for us to consider here. So we're really thinking broadly across all of these different restoration types. Another aspect of this work that we've been doing sort of reviewing and synthesizing these restoration outcomes is looking at what different projects, what different processes have motivated projects. So you can see in orange there, our largest single category are projects that have been undertaken for mitigation of water project impacts, largely through the fish restoration program. Projects under the Delta Levees program at DWR are about 33% of the projects, and those two project categories together come together under the umbrella of the Eco Restore program, which I think many of you are familiar with. Other mitigation projects make up about 11% of the projects across planned, in progress, and completed. Some what we call green infrastructure projects, so focusing on different functions that can be achieved with restoration in addition to ecological benefits are about 10%. And then 9% of projects have been non-mandated restoration. So restoration sort of just for the sake of creating habitat without a mitigation requirement or specific infrastructure goal. And I will highlight that these numbers, just so it's perfectly clear, actually do go back before 2007. This particular graph, it includes projects that were completed before 2007 as well, just to give us a sense of the broader arc going back to actually the mid-1980s of what's gone on in the system. So, you know, as I've said, this question of how we meet these targets is one that we've brought you all together here today to talk about. And the key piece here, that one of the reasons why we're so excited to be doing this work under the auspices of a Delta Plan Interagency Implementation Committee subcommittee, is that we have the opportunity to be regularly communicating what we're hearing in forums like this back to the decision makers who serve on the DPIIC. And so that is our longer term vision for all of the information that you're generating today. We're going to be collecting that. We're going to be reviewing it and synthesizing it. And then we're going to make sure that this continues to get communicated to folks who are in the seats that are making some of the larger scale decisions that will determine the future of what restoration looks like in the Delta. Again, just really happy to be bringing you all together here today. And with that, I think we have about 15 minutes for questions. Because we're navigating the hybrid approach to question answering here, so we'll be seated here. We will have some questions that are coming from the Q&A on Zoom that Rachel will read out and let us know. We'll also have folks in the room. We'll just take a sort of, you know, first hand raised order of answering your questions. Because of the way that, you know, the funny intricacies of the microphones, what we'll do is we're just going to leave our microphone on up here. So you'll say your question, and then we'll ask us panelists to repeat the question that was asked, and then answer it by stepping up to the podium here so that all of our virtual participants can also hear us and see us clearly. So might look like a, you know, kind of a funny dance up here for a little bit, but yeah, we appreciate you sticking with it as we navigate our way through this hybrid reality. So with that, I'm going to take a step back from the podium and we can start the question process.
So as Dylan said, I'm just going to be moderating the Q&A, both calling on folks in person and reading things off from the Q&A in the webinar. So is there anyone in the room who would like to ask a first question of any of the panelists? Yes.
So I'm wondering, all right, sorry. I'm wondering why 2009, because the Delta plan, I mean, it's 2009.
2007 is your baseline. I'm curious. That's one of my questions. And then the other question, so I'll just ask a couple of them, was how you came up with your, in general, your targets.
And the last one has to do with the Oak Woodlands and Vernal Pool
goals, because I know those were in the CalFed Bay Delta program too, but I'm curious where those came from. So those are my three.
And there's a request in the chat that the people asking questions, if you could please just state your name so that folks know who's asking.
Anitra Polly with the Department of Water Resources.
Thank you, Anitra.
Okay, so we had a question from Anitra Polly.
Okay, well, restart. So we had a question from Anitra Polly from,
No, that's just.
I think we're good.
Yeah, I think you're good as well.
Okay, sorry, we've got a complicated multi-screen setup here. We had a question from Anitra Polly at the Department of Water Resources. The first question was why the 2007 baseline? A lot of that was driven by data availability. So we used VegCamp as part of that baseline to be able to do a spatial analysis across the landscape. VegCamp, as some of you may know, is done in two parts often. There's part for Suisun Marsh and part for the Delta. They're not aligned in time. And so we had to go back to that date and do a crosswalk between slightly misaligned categorization of land uses. And that was the most recent best data we had at the time. There subsequently has been a VegCamp update, but at that time, right when we were doing the amendment, it wasn't in place yet. So that was for that date. The second question was about how did we come up with the goals or the targets, as sometimes have been noted. So there's a 60 to 80,000 acre broad goal within the amendment. That's driven by 14 recovery plans. These are broadly kind of requirements of the fishery agencies, NIMS, NOAA, others that laid out, and CalFed as well, goals for what they felt is required for recovery, primarily of listed species. Those are listed in Appendix Q4 of the amendment, and we can provide that as a list for anyone who's interested, but that's where the numbers are being pulled from. And the last question is, what about oak woodlands and vernal pools? Those numbers also come from those documents. There is maybe an underlying question of how does that apply to the Delta, maybe, because some of those are broader. The planning units that some of the agencies use, including the Central Valley, or sorry, the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan, they have different conservation units or different units. And we tried to do an allocation within those, but because it's not spatially explicit, there isn't exactly a one-to-one mapping. And so that is part of the reason that there's no way to make them regulatory, because you could do them in the Delta. Some of them, like oak woodland, they could be somewhere else as well.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. We have a question in the Q&A for the online group. So David Groves asks, and I think this is probably for Dan or Dylan. I'm unclear why the many thousands of acres of compensatory mitigation are being included in the overall restoration goals of the Delta, since they are offsetting impacts occurring elsewhere in the watershed.
So I think, did everyone hear the question? Okay, great.
For the people online.
Oh, right, sorry. So we, can you repeat their name, please?
Yeah, sure, David Groves.
So we had a question from David Gross asking for clarification about how compensatory mitigation, how the numbers associated with that, which may include areas beyond the Delta, perhaps why that is being mitigated within the Delta as well. The short answer is, I want to emphasize again, this is non-regulatory. So these list out broad goals. Some of these may not happen in the Delta. There's no requirement there. We're trying to acknowledge what is already being done and what the agencies through these recovery plans have listed. And so a lot of these are appropriate for the Delta, especially some of the tidal restoration goals. You can't do that in a lot of places, including up and down valley. It doesn't make sense in those locations. But to acknowledge, again, this is non-regulatory. There's no true compensatory from a mitigation perspective action happening under the Delta plan. It's laying out a vision for what has to be done if you want to recover these species.
Yeah, Leo.
Leo Winternitz, I noticed the chart you had up there showed a significant number of planned projects, significant percentage of planned projects are treated as completed projects. Why is that? And a follow-up question to that is, what percentage of planned projects in your experience actually become projects?
Yeah, great question. So from Leo Winternitz, the question was about planned projects that are counted as completed. And so I will have a follow-up question for you on that. And then also what the ratio of projects that have been planned actually gets completed. And so for the first one, I think one of the things that I'll say is that the way we defined completed here was that all of the initial construction activities that were scoped under the environmental documents had been were done effectively. So one of the aspects of restoration that, of course, is really notable is that it takes a long time for a project to actually reach its full development. So that's kind of a limitation that we acknowledge here, and that some of these projects, even post-construction, it may be 2 decades before they actually gain the full ecological function that they're designed to provide. For us, I think what we're really focusing on is like the implementation of getting projects in the ground. So because that's really variable, and also because that takes a degree of data availability that is really intensive, and that data itself will take a long time. At this stage, we're really just looking at this first step. But a big part of the conversation, and actually in many other slide decks I've taken presenting this work, we do take pains to point out that there is this longer term need to really understand the development of projects, even when most of your shovels are moved off of the landscape. To your second question about the longer term, what proportion of projects that are planned actually do happen. I think that it has been an exciting time. I'm glad you didn't ask me that question, 5 years ago, because it would have been a much different picture out there. The progress in recent years has been fantastic. And for thinking back to the image that was behind Virginia when she presented the Dutch Slough project. I think the Dutch Slough project, some of the initial scoping for that is maybe even late 90s. Some of the original plans for Dutch Slough are 2003. So there has been a slow burn on those, but I do think that a really high proportion, particularly of the larger scale projects that have been scoped, we are seeing them move towards completion. And that's why we were conservative with what we included in the planned project category, though, because we know that there are, the Frank's Tract Futures project is one that I think many folks in the room here were involved with, that does take this broader look at planning there, but there's not a definitive shovel-ready plan for that yet. And so we talk about it in our report, but we don't include it in our acreage. So
do your planned projects include completed funding? You said there's environmental documentation, permits, all that's completed.
Yeah.
Is there funding then for the implementation phase as well under your planned project?
Yeah, that in particular wasn't a criteria, and part of that is because as most of us many of us in the room have had experience with, oftentimes funding comes in drips and drabs, and this is actually a real challenge that faces restoration projects. They're really expensive to move land at the scale of thousands of acres is just a very expensive undertaking, and so there are a lot of projects where you get some initial funding for a planning grant, then you get some more funding to do this, and you get some more funding to do this, and you're really sort of stepping up your project over time through that. And so we didn't use that as a specific criteria just because that looks so different from project to project.
Really quickly state the follow-up question.
Oh yeah, sorry. Yeah, so the follow-up question for our virtual participants was whether funding was considered as part of the criteria for looking at planned projects. And so that was the question I just answered.
All right, I think we have time for one more question. We have one from the Zoom crowd. So Dennis Baldoci asks, given continued soil subsidence across the Delta, is 60 to 80,000 acres by 2050 enough and fast enough to avoid Delta collapse? So,
so a question by Professor Dennis Baldoci about whether or not the 60 or 70,000 acre target in the Delta is sufficient to avoid Delta collapse when you're looking at subsidence and stopping subsidence and carbon emissions out of the Delta. I think the short answer there is no. But I think it's also really interesting to think about what the targets mean in that regard. We're working very hard right now to come up with economically viable incentives to put more water on the landscape through rice cultivation, and then inundating lands that are already too wet to farm to create managed wetlands that would be economically viable, as well as be more sustainable for the Delta moving forward. So we're very excited about those opportunities, and I think there's really nothing in the targets that would prevent us from moving beyond those targets, provided that we have willing landowners and people willing to work on those projects. I also wanted to just go back to Leo Winternitz's question and just say that whole discussion, I think, was just really illustrative of the value or the purpose of the Restoration Subcommittee. Is really coming together and trying to identify those key points and key challenges and work collectively with all the agencies to figure out how do we address those issues and move forward.
Great. All right, well, thank you all so much for engaging, and folks will be around today at the end of the forum during the yeah, it's like a little gremlin in there. Excellent. So we're going to take a break and we're going to return here at 4:05. I want to remind the virtual participants that there is a Zoom meeting link that the meeting support team is going to put in the chat right now. When we come back for our group conversations, which is our next agenda item, you'll need to be in the Zoom meeting link in order to participate. So if you're still in the webinar at that time, you're going to be directed over to the meeting. There are, as I said, the bathrooms outside. You'll need the key. Looks like somebody already made the jump for that. And then there are snacks both in the break room and some baked goods in the big pink box out front. Please try to be back, everyone in here, around 4:05, and we'll give some orientation to our next activity. So thank you much for your attention during this first hour.
Sorry, we're having a little echo still. Are we good? Okay, thanks everyone. Looks like you had a lot of really great discussions. So like Rachel said, we're gonna do a last little report out with one more mentee question. So you can see on the slide there what the question will be. So I'm gonna go ahead and open that up. And again, the mentee code should be on the screen. Now, where is it? Oh. And this, I have to go to the right one. This is the other one. Sec. Okay, yeah, so what is your top takeaway and or what is one thing you learned from the discussion? So just for a couple minutes, maybe we can look at these. Let's see. Okay, so projects are a mosaic for funding sources, benefits, priorities, et cetera, and that presents both opportunities and challenges. Having farmers in the restoration discussion is key. Let's see, from my perspective in the grant I'm managing, we are already creating a program model that is addressing the questions posed in today's workshop. Great. Let's see. Performance monitoring is important and should consider social factors. Let's look at, let's see. Oh, it can scroll. Okay. It was great to see so many participants. Coordinating funding is a huge challenge. All right, so we're gonna leave this up for a bit so you can keep seeing this. Yeah, but then I think Dylan, were you next?
Great. Thanks, Annie, for getting us started here. And I really do appreciate it. So I was in the Zoom cave helping facilitate those groups. And so a lot of what we're seeing, oh, yes, I was still in the Zoom cave. A lot of what we're seeing up on the screen here as well is folks from our Zoom groups contributing. Yeah, just figuring out how best to do this in breakout rooms in a hybrid setting. So we really want to thank everybody for attending today. For our Zoom participants, this will be the end of our formal program, but as I mentioned in the Zoom, we also do have a fact sheet with information from the folks who will be presenting projects for our in-person open house. And so for those of you here in person, we will be having this open house. Really excited for folks to bring some materials, learn about some new projects and programs that are developing, as well as ongoing efforts. And this is something that we really see as probably being an important aspect of restoration forums moving forward, is being able to really just bring a place that people can share work that's in progress, share things they're thinking about, get to meet others or catch up with colleagues that you don't get a chance to see in person. And so, we'd love any of your feedback also on how we could make this type of open house thing more effective in the future as well. So spread throughout these two spaces, we have a handful of posters out here, and then the numbers on the table are very ingeniously dual purpose. So they're going to flip over and we'll have some programs and projects also sitting at these tables. So you can go ahead and flip those numbers over. So those folks will be sitting there. So please, feel free to talk with your colleagues. Yeah, we got one over there. Okay. And I'll just sort of list out for your information. We have the Wildlife Conservation Board. We have the Elk Slough Fish Passage Project, the Delta Conservancy, the Nature Conservancy Bird Returns, the Buena Vista Rancheria, the 30 by 30 CNRA effort, the SF Bay Restoration Authority, and the CDFW Cutting the Green Tape and Prop 1 grants programs are all represented here today. So again, we're hoping that this is a bridge to bringing in even more folks to future meetings. I will also give one last plug here for and then I'll stop. But for both our virtual and our in-person participants, we have exit surveys. So there's a handful of exit surveys here. And there's a handful of exit surveys out there in the main room. There'll be a link placed in the chat as well for our virtual exit survey. So we're really trying to cover our bases here as much as we can. And so we would really appreciate you all filling this out to let us know sort of how this went, allow us to look pretty comprehensively. So there's also little signs for just where you can place your exit survey on your way out. So I think, let me just make sure that we're covering everything here. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, no, the most important part. I'm so sorry. Snack foods and drinks are out there. I think most of you have seen them by now. I think that's a real nice part about being back in person here is the food. So please enjoy yourselves. Take some time to catch up with each other. And just a huge thanks again for making this event such a vibrant, interactive experience. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for the
Mr. Dillon has mentioned this, but there's lots of snacks still in the break room.
And there's snacks, yeah.